in the middle of chapter 9. We're answering the question. Our question of this chapter, at least the question so far, is how can it be that God, not how can it be, how can it be is it's a very arrogant thing to say. How can it be? My understanding, our understanding should declare what can be. It's hard to understand what it means that God's will can change. Right? What's our example? Our example is that once upon a time God wanted the Beis Hamikdash to be standing. Then he desired that it should be destroyed. And we ask him every day, may it be your will, may it be your desire, that the Beis Hamikdash should be rebuilt. Well, the question is, how can it be that his desire changes? That now he wants the Beis Hamikdash to not be there, but we want him to change his mind, so to speak. We want him to change what he wants. We want him to desire that the Beis Hamikdash, that the temple, should be rebuilt. So what does it mean that God can change his mind? Seems like a problem. We say God doesn't change, right? God exists as an absolute unity, an absolute simplicity. The creation does not change him at all. And yet we ask him to change his will, to change what he wants. How is this possible? So,
you could say it sounds arrogant.
What sounds arrogant?
Ask him to change his will, in a sense.
Well, we pray. God tells us to pray, so we pray. It's not a human-initiated process.
Right.
God says, I want you to ask me to change my mind. But the thing is that we don't understand what that means. How can it be that he wants one thing and then wants another thing? The question is not really on the davening, which is requested by God. In fact, we actually say that a person can daven too much. If a person goes beyond the prayers which are established and starts praising God with his own words or calling God by his own descriptions, it's a very bad thing.
Giduf.
We have no place to be able to describe him or say his praises. It's a very famous story. There's a certain rabbi who was saying many praises of God, and then his friend asked him, well, are you going to stop there? He stopped saying the praises, and he continued davening. He said, well, why are your praises stopping there? Right? God is infinite. There's no time when you can stop the praises. You're implying that he has only deserves 20 words of praise. Why not 21? Why not 25? Why not 300? Right? How can you stop? God is infinite. So the idea is that we do not praise God according to the amount of praise that he deserves. That would be a never-ending process. We praise God in the ways that it has been revealed through prophecy that God wants to be praised. The prophets of God and holy men, the way that they have praised him, so we praise him too. That's why all of davening is based on the Tehillim and based on the Tanakh and things that the different Nevi'im and the different rabbis said, and the different sages, their understanding of how God himself wishes to be spoken to places a limit on the prayer. So we don't pray according to what seems to us to be appropriate, because then we would be stuck. We would either pray forever or we would stop, and then we would be implying that it seems appropriate that we should stop, that a limited amount of praise belongs to God. So we avoid the entire problem altogether, and we only say the prayers which are established by prophecy. That's the smart thing to do. The praises that were established by the sages. So that's a separate issue. The question is not about davening. The question is about what does it mean that God should change his will? In general, I mean, if you understand that even without the Chassidic understanding of Hashgacha Pratis, that everything that takes place within the world, the last detail, is supervised by God and happens in accordance with his will, and in some way contributes to his larger plan for the creation, even if you take a much more mundane and a much more secular look, and you just want to say something more like, God participates in the major events in history, even if only the major events, right? Nevertheless, the desires change, right? First he wants this country to be on top, and then he wants this country to be on top, obviously, right? First he favors this person, and then he favors that person. I mean, if this is the way it seems, right? If you want to anthropomorphize, but so we say much further. We say that in every detail, all change is desired by God. You could ask this question theoretically about any change. We're asking it about the change in the Beis Hamikdash because this is a place where the sages have specifically established. In other words, we're not basing it on our general knowledge of Judaism. The sages have specifically established that in a situation where God clearly wants one thing, that is, for there not to be a Beis Hamikdash, we put in the prayer that we ask him, Yehi Ratzon, may it be your will, literally, please change your your will to desire the rebuilding of the Beis HaMikdash, that the Beis HaMikdash should actually be rebuilt. Yes? So the reason why we ask on this specific thing has less to do with the fact that it's only this area where God's changing his mind, or it's only in connection with prayer. It just has to do with the fact that this is what we're most certain about. It's the clearest cut. It's a very clear-cut and familiar example from within Judaism itself, right? Rather than us trying to apply Judaism to all sorts of other cases which may or may not apply, which you may or may not understand. Goes back to what I said in the first thing in this class, which is we're not relying on our own minds here. Let's look at the evidence that is available within Judaism and within Torah, which is the way of Chassidus. Right? If we are to understand Torah, it is through Torah itself. And so we have this example of saying God should change his mind. What's the answer to this question? We said a couple of things last week. The first thing we said is that the Tosfos Yom Tov, student of the Maharal of Prague, writes in his commentary on Pirkei Avos that the God creates the creation in such a way from the beginning that the creation obeys his will as history will unfold. Again, God creates things from the 6 days of creation, from the time of the Maimer, is how it actually says in the language of the Tosfos Yom Tov. From the utterance. And what utterance is he referring to? The utterances that created the world, like let there be light. The 10 utterances with which God creates the world. From that very time, God has already made a condition with the world that the world should do all of the things that it's meant to do. Right? The famous example is that God makes a condition with the Yam Suf, with the Sea of Reeds, that when the Jews will be standing on your shores, you will split for them. And that's a condition that's made from the 6 days of creation. From when the sea is originally created, there's all these conditions. So in other words, the Tzemach Tzedek says what you might take out from the Tosfos Yom Tov is that God does not directly change his mind, so to speak, or intervene in such cases of miracles, right? It wouldn't be God, so to speak, changing his desire, that first he wants there to not be a Beis HaMikdash, and then he wants there to be a Beis HaMikdash. Rather, he has created the world in such a way that the world, as history unfolds, performs as it is supposed to at the correct time. That everything by nature, it's simply built into the creation that the world will do what it needs to do at the time when it needs to do it. And this is, so to speak, part of nature. Tzemach Tzedek and the Tzemach Tzedek.
You eliminate the Bechira Chofshit?
No. Nothing to do with Bechira Chofshit. Nothing. No connection. No, not particularly. What's the connection?
Because Moshe made those miracles to convince Paro to let them go.
Yeah.
Now, Paro could have agreed after the third one, to let them go. And then he would chase them. Would the water be open in that case? Yes or no?
What do you mean?
It's like, it took Moshe like 10 times until Paro was convinced.
Yeah.
What if...
But it's all, that's what I'm saying, is why does this change the question? It's all determined from beforehand anyway.
So
the question, the whole question with free will is how can it be that God knows everything that's going to happen in advance, but people can still choose?
Okay.
This doesn't change that at all. God in any case knows what's going to happen in advance. It doesn't matter. The question stands however we're going to answer this question. It's not going to make the question on Bechira particularly less. All I'm saying is that the things which are predetermined are also built into nature, not necessarily into human decisions. It's a separate idea. The idea is that the world and history unfold according to God's will, but the way that they unfold according to God's will is not by his will changing, but rather by one initial desire. In the creation of everything has already happened. In other words, we're saying that the state which we say is about the question, the aspect of God about which the question of free choice arises, namely that he exists outside of time and he knows everything that's going to happen before it happens. Yes, so that aspect of himself, so to speak, he invested within the creation. In other words, God does see, any way you look at it, in Judaism, God knows everything before it's going to happen anyway. There's no getting around that point. That's why it's such a strong question. Mm-hmm. There's no getting around that point. What the Tosfos Yom Tov is saying, and I didn't get to the point yet, I didn't get to the next sentence yet before you asked the question where I said the Tzemach Tzedek rejects this understanding. But within the Tosfos Yom Tov, what the Tosfos Yom Tov says the God's foreknowledge of things is also built into the way that the universe unfolds. In other words, God doesn't have to desire one thing and then desire another thing. He desires only one thing. All he desires is that the universe should be the way it is when he initially creates the universe, and everything that's going to happen in some sense is built into the universe. In other words, in a certain sense, it's more in this understanding of the Tosfos Yom Tov. It's more of a sort of like a clockwork universe sort of thing. It's almost, in some sense, it's almost like a deist thing. I don't want to go that far and say that it's like God abandons the universe, so I don't think that's what the Tosfos Yom Tov was saying, but it's more along those lines, in the sense that the universe itself has built into it. God only has one will, and that one will generates the entire universe and everything that happens in it over time. The changes are built into that one will. His will doesn't change. There's only one initial desire, and everything else that's change is simply the unfurling of that desire over time. That the desire simply is staggered in the way that it actually appears. It doesn't happen all at once.
So we believe that we actually have a choice, or we choose things, but actually it's predefined by him even before?
No, it's pre-known by him before, is the question.
Pre-known is predefined?
No, it's not.
Pre-known, okay, I agree. Yeah, it doesn't make a difference. I mean, it's like he knows and we do.
The question is a very deep question. It's not really the topic of our class, and it exists at multiple levels, but that, at least know that is the question. The question is God, how can it be that God knows everything before it happens? God knows exactly what's going to happen, and yet we still have free will. And in some ways, the Rambam writes that this question is one of the great questions of Judaism, and many mountains hang off of it, and it's very hard for the human mind to even comprehend. And the Ravid writes it's not so difficult, and here's the answer. And the Ravid gives his answer, and they're both right. They're both
But he
right.
doesn't operate in
Both of them are right. The one that gives the simple answer is right.
Is it fair to say that since the world is being created, I'm sorry,
Has nothing to do with that.
since the world is being created, every minute,
God exists
within
above
the realm
time.
of time.
So he knows
And
everything
here
that
we're
was,
talking about
is,
the
and is
ratzon,
going to
that
be.
is the indicator of
because he can move time
beyond
What's
around.
about to happen?
right?
Time's here. No?
He
He
knows
can
what-
say,
Ratzon
he
is
knows
nothing,
what
nothing,
has
nothing.
happened.
It
He's
has nothing
above
to do with
time.
He's just
time.
watching it.
So the fact that we affect the ratzon doesn't change
He
it.
knows what choice you're going to make before
make
you
sense?
make
That's
that
the thing.
choice. But
So-
you have free will to
Right.
make that
so we
choice.
choose,
too
but I mean,
Kabbalistic for me.
it's like he knows in advance what are we going to choose. That's the thing.
Yes, because you've already
I don't
done
know.
it.
Let's learn further. and we'll
You've
see.
already
We are
chosen.
programmed that way, so he knows the program.
There's
No,
no
it's not the
contradiction.
program.
There's no contradiction that
No.
God created the world.
He knows what you chose
Everything
because
was
you have
built
already
in.
done it from his perspective.
Right.
Okay,
He sees
so what was going to happen, yeah?
everything that was,
Past
that
and
is.
future in the same time.
Exactly, there's no time. So it's not that because you're programmed a certain way, otherwise you'd have no free choice. He knows what choice you made
You have free choice, but he knows in advance what you're going to choose.
because you already chose it from
There
his
is no
perspective.
advance in his level.
No, yeah, exactly.
his realm.
He
He's
knows.
not
He
advanced.
knows. He knows in
There's no
advance
arrears.
because you have already done it. He knows only because
Time is not an issue there.
because you have
Yeah,
already
there is no
chosen.
time.
But in that case, so
Well,
how does
he
he
can
open
move
the
time
let's see,
backwards and
Yam
forwards.
Suf?
Time is not linear. Time
We
is
haven't got there yet.
dynamical.
This has nothing to do with the Yom Suf. We're talking about miracles and
Yeah,
free
but
will. We're
time's
talking
only
about two
in this
completely
sphere.
different things, which I think
Not in his
we're
sphere.
missing the point.
Okay, Tzvi.
All right,
This
yeah,
is his sphere too.
missing the point here. The free will
It's
thing
not
has
the
nothing
same.
to do.
Do we want to talk about?
That's
Are we
true.
talking about free choice, or are we talking about our?
No, please
discourse?
let's talk
Sorry,
about
should
the
we talk
class.
about-
I apologize.
Not-
I
no
had a
problem.
question not regarding
Yes.
man's free choice.
Yes.
If everything was built into the world in its creation,
Yes.
okay, and then we say God is continuously creating,
Yeah.
is there not any, I mean, is that just beyond understand on what that means? Or
No, not really, because it's as weird as the continual creation is, even without that idea. The continual creation is a weird idea. What's the persistent identity of something if God is continually creating it? If you answer that question, I think you answered your question. In other words, what does it mean that this chair is this chair?
Right.
And as time goes on, it's this second, and then there's 10 seconds from now, and God creates the world constantly, meaning if at any moment God were to cease creating it, it would cease to exist, which seems to imply maybe that there's some sort of granularity there, right? That you could say every 1 second it's sort of a new chair being created, maybe, depending on the nature of time, which, by the way, is not one of the easier concepts in Chassidus, and is going to come up in this discourse, if with God's help we can ever get there. So the question becomes, what makes it the same chair? Why does it have the same identity? How does something even have the same identity if God recreated every moment? So I think it's a good question. But, so if you answer that question, I think you answer your question. And the answer to that question is it's not in this mimer. Okay.
Can we kind of get to the next sentence?
Working on
everything
it.
we've discussed so far, Hasidus doesn't.
We haven't. Yes. So
said we would
this idea that he attributes to the Tosfos Yom Tov, which I'm not exactly sure the extent to which the Tzemach Tzedek is saying, is actually what the Tosfos Yom Tov holds. In other words, it's sort of something that the Tzemach Tzedek is inferring from what the Tosfos Yom Tov writes there. Very famously, it's a very famous Tosfos Yom Tov with regards to the splitting of the sea, and God puts within nature that nature should so to speak, follow the will of God, even though God doesn't necessarily. So the thing is about all of that's all very hypothetical. What the Tzemach Tzedek says is ultimately that this is not really the case. Anyway, we view God very differently as God being totally involved in the creation of every moment, and He's utterly omnipotent, and He doesn't need to make conditions with the creation. He can split the sea right then if he wants to, right? So the Tzemach Tzedek says that the Tosfos Yom Tov is reading the Tosfos Yom Tov that is not the correct way to read the Tosfos Yom Tov, basically. Rather, we can explain this in the way that the Rambam explains it. We can explain this in the way that Mor Nevuchim explains it. And there's going to be multiple levels. It's a little bit confusing. But the way it's going to work is like this, and I haven't got to the end of our class yesterday. In other words, last week, I haven't got to the metaphor that we're in the middle of, because I want to give this preface first before we do that metaphor. That basically, we're going to explain, it's going to be like a kal v'chomer. You know what a kal v'chomer is? A kal v'chomer is when you say, you ask your boss if you can have a raise of $10 per month, and your boss says no, so you ask him, we can have a raise of $100 per month, right? In other words, from the smaller case, from the lesser case, you can derive the more the larger, so to speak. Kal v'chomer literally means the lenient and the strict. From the lenient case, you can learn out the stricter case. If I can't get a raise of $10, obviously I can't get a raise of $100. This is one of the foundations of Torah learning, one of the first of the 13 principles with which Rabbi Yishmael told us we can learn out. We can do biblical exegesis. I don't know if that's how it's pronounced. Perhaps exegesis. I don't know. Exegesis sounds like a different religion, so I think I like exegesis. But the 13. So you can see there in the Siddur, at the beginning of the Siddur, where it talks about the 13 different things. Okay. So we're going to do a kal v'chomer. We're going to say that even the Rambam answers this question. In other words, this question is not difficult even for the Rambam. And we're going to look at the Rambam's answer. And we're going to actually provide a Hasidus metaphor for the Rambam's answer, which is interesting. And then we're going to say that the Rambam's answer is really only a subset of the broader truth, of the broader reality as Hasidus sees it, and therefore, kal v'chomer, in Hasidus this is not a problem. In other words, even for the Rambam, in his limited perspective, this is not an issue. And us, who have a broader perspective, it is certainly not an issue. That's basically the flow of the next part of this chapter. So what's the issue? What's the thing that's not an issue? Again, is that God's will changes. So we say like this, there's a metaphor. The metaphor, well, what's the Rambam's answer? Before he gets to the metaphor, what's the Rambam's answer? The Rambam's answer is something that we've said many times in this class already, is that hu ha'yodeya v'hu ha'yodua v'hu ha'mada. That God is the knower, the knowledge, and the known. That God, by dint of being God in His infinitude, knows the world by knowing Himself. He does not know the world as a human being knows the world with a limited knowledge. A limited knowledge actually has to perceive the world and grasp the form of the world to understand it. And the changing form of the world, therefore, impacts our limited knowledge. God does not have limited knowledge. God has infinite knowledge. He knows the entire world by knowing Himself. He is both the knower, He is the faculty of knowledge, and He is the object of the knowledge. And by the unity of these three things are not really three things, really they're one thing, and that one thing is God. And that's impossible for a human being to understand. That's what the Rambam says about God's knowledge. We're going to say that the Rambam says basically a very similar thing about God's desire. That God is the willer or the desirer. He is the faculty of desire, and He is the object of the desire. And God desires other things simply by desiring Himself. And this is the Rambam's answer. The answer is that God does not have a separate faculty of desire. He doesn't have a faculty of desire that changes like the human faculty of desire. There is no reason to limit God's desire or God's will by human will. God's will exists beyond our will. It exists beyond understanding, and He is able to will things. Even though it appears to us that the will changes, really the will doesn't change because He wills everything by willing Himself, and whatever that means is beyond human understanding. He's God. He's able to do these things. There's no reason to assume that His will is limited to the limits of our will. That's the Rambam's answer to the question of how can God's will change. The answer is God's will doesn't change. It's just, it appears to us that it changes, but God's will simply works in such a way that by willing Himself with one constant will, the changes of the world appear to happen. If that sounds outlandish, then you should have objected many weeks ago, because it's the exact same explanation for how the Rambam can know a changing world. How can the Rambam's knowledge be limited and changed? The Rambam knows the tree when it's only a sapling, and he knows the tree when it becomes a huge oak. Doesn't that mean that God's knowledge changes? The world changes. So God knows it in one moment, and then later God knows the tree as it's much bigger. So doesn't that mean that God's knowledge of the world changes? The Rambam's answer is no. You're making a mistake. You think you're limiting God's knowledge, that He knows things the way a human being knows things, and that's not how God knows. God knows by knowing Himself. It is an infinite knowledge. Through knowing Himself, He knows everything, and this is beyond the human mind to understand. That's the Rambam's explanation, both for knowledge and for will. And the Tzemach Tzedek proceeds to explain this according to Kabbalah, of course. Right? The Rambam speaking strictly philosophically, and the Tzemach Tzedek is going to explain it with a mashal from Kabbalah and Chassidus, with a metaphor. The Tzemach Tzedek explains it as follows. He says, this is what we said last week, that the Sefer Yetzirah, one of the oldest Kabbalah work, if I'm not mistaken, calls the 10 spheres, God's means of creating the world, he calls them Eser Spheres Blima. They're 10 spheres without what, is literally the translation of Blima. Why are they called Blima, without what? Because the mahus of the spheres, the mahus of God's knowledge, let's use an example, or the mahus of God's will, we're going to translate mahus in a moment, is not the same as the mahus of what they create. The mahus of the spheres, the mahus of God's will, the mahus of God's knowledge is not the same as the mahus of what they create. Mahus, we struggled to translate last week. Mahus means form or essence or whatness in the most literal translation. Mahus comes from the Hebrew word ma, which means what. The mahus of the thing is the what is it. And I defined it last week. It's defined as definition. It is. I defined it, and in the process of defining it, I also demonstrated it. Because the mahus is the definition of the thing. The mahus, in other words, the mahus of mahus is its definition. That's what I'm saying. In other words, the mahus of a thing is the aspect of it that separates it from everything else and makes it the thing that it is. In Aristotelian terms, or the terms the Rambam would understand, you would call this most likely the tzura. You would call it the form, the formal cause of the thing. It's what distinguishes it. What makes the wallet different than the watch is not that the wallet and the watch are fundamentally made of different matter, because everything is made of the same matter. Even in modern physics, we would say everything is made of the same electrons, protons, neutrons, right? It's all just stuff. It's the same stuff in everything. What makes them different is the arrangement, is the form, is the way the things come together. And what distinguishes the mahus of something, the essence of it, is all that distinguishes it from being another thing. So the mahus of a person, when you ask what's the mahus of a human being, there's different answers to the question. If you ask what the mahus of a human being is as opposed to an animal, as opposed to all other animals, you would say that the mahus is a thinking animal. That's what distinguishes the human being from other animals. And then you get into what does thinking mean? Don't animals also think? The answer is no, but in a certain way, animals do think, obviously, but they don't think in a certain way. They don't think in the way that humans do. Humans have a unique capacity for thought, which is directly connected to their ability to speak, which is why in Chassidus, the human division of creation is called medaber, mina medaber, the speaker. The human being speaks. But you could also ask, when I ask you what's the mechus of a certain man, of a certain person, I'm asking you what makes him him and not someone else, right? You would talk about his specific achievements, his life story, his personality, and all of that together would define him as not as someone else, right? But then I would say, well, you say he went to a certain high school, but that's not really part of his mahus, because the other people went to that high school. So what distinguishes him from the people that went to his school? And so to all of his other experiences. And what you do is, as you get closer to the definition of what this specific thing is, you have to move up the scale away from the externalities of the person, away from the things that are accidental, would be the philosophical term. You move away from the fact that he happened to be born in the United States is not the most defining thing about him. There's 300 million people that share the same quality, right? That's not what makes him him. So you move up, you would move from the most external things. He's male, he was born in the United States, and then you'd move to higher things. You'd born into things that he's done, or you'd move into things that he's spoken, things that he's thought. You would move into his actual personality, and eventually you would actually go to the very essence of his soul. And this is why mahus can also be translated as essence. Because even though really the translation of the word is what distinguishes one thing from another, really, if you want to find out what really distinguishes something, you have to get into the real depth of the thing. You really have to understand it fully, at its deepest depth, to understand what separates it and makes it different from other things. This is the appreciation of the mahus. This is the essence or the whatness of a thing. So the spheres are called without mahus. What does that mean? It doesn't mean they're literally without any mahus, at least not how we're saying it here. We're saying what it means is that they don't share a mahus of the things that they created. They don't share one mahus with the things that come out of them. What do we mean by that? So we give the mashal. The mashal is like this. The person takes, I have a whiteboard so I could demonstrate, but I'm not going to. The person takes his hand and he takes a marker and he draws an aleph, right? He draws the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, right? The letter comes from nowhere except his hand, seemingly. And yet, if you were actually to go into his hand and look for something that was in the shape of an aleph, you wouldn't find it. Right? Because the truth is, where does the aleph come from? The aleph comes from your mind. And yet, if you were to actually go in the person's brain and dig around, you would never find the shape of an aleph, despite everything that modern science may claim. You will never find, when you dissect a person's brain, you could dissect it, I don't care how long you dissect it or how you analyze it, you will never find an aleph in the person's brain, because the aleph is not in the brain. The aleph is in the mind. It's the soul's conception. You have the mind's conception of the aleph, and the aleph then travels from your mind through to your hand, and your soul manipulates your hand, and the shape of an aleph is drawn on the board. Right?
Does it come from your memory?
Yeah, your mind more generally. The memory is a part of the mind.
But the memory is something which is there. I mean, if you will be able to read it, you will be able to read it.
What?
The memory of a person.
Yes, it's part of the mind. That's what I just said.
Yeah, but the mind is something which is physical. It's not like something.
No, the mind is something which is spiritual, at least according to Chassidus. It's complicated because the spiritual and the physical meet. So it's not like they're really two separate things, right? A person is made up of a body and a soul, and the body and the soul are not two separate things that are shoved together, as if by miracle necessarily. They're also two things which are integrated one into the other. The soul and the body form one being. So the truth is that the soul and the body parallel each other very much. That's why spiritual sickness can hurt a person physically, and vice versa, right? And physical health is important for spiritual health, and vice versa. Right? But ultimately, even though they do meet and they do integrate, and obviously one can affect the other, ultimately the mind of the person, and in what nowadays we would call the higher function, the higher brain function, which they call a brain function, but really it's a mind function. And as far as I know, there's no evidence to the contrary. the higher mind function exists separate from the brain. So in some sense, I'm sure that memories are in some sense stored in the brain, because in some sense every aspect of the mind has a corresponding part of the brain. But ultimately, as Hasidus would explain, the soul ultimately transcends and is above and is a spiritual entity, not a physical entity, and not an emergent property of a physical entity, which has become the last refuge of the scientists, desperately searching for the mind inside the head.
Well,
at least as far as I understand.
Rabbi Wolf mentioned said when you have a person who's passed away, the eye is still a physical eye. Why doesn't it see?
Right. At the exact moment of death,
At the
yes.
exact moment.
I'm not sure. I don't know what a biologist would answer to that question. I don't know. But as far as I'm aware, the attempt to explain the mind in terms of the brain has so far not been very successful. As far as I'm
Just to
aware.
reiterate what he's mentioning, that at the time of death, the eye is still the same intact. It's a physical eye, it's still there, but the eye doesn't see.
It just transmits.
Yeah, it's a sensor.
Right.
The same thing, I mean, it doesn't feel it with his hands because, I mean,
Right, it's an
the
instrument.
machine doesn't work
It's an
anymore.
instrument of the neshama.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No problem. So, the aleph is a form which is conceived of by the mind. It's hard to even understand how physical matter could possibly have the experience of knowing an aleph, right? This gets more into philosophy than into science itself, right? The mind perceives an aleph. The classic question, for which I don't know if there's really a materialist answer to this question. The answer is how does physical matter have the subjective experience of knowing an aleph? Right? In other words, it has a sense of self. How does something gain a sense of self, and in that sense of self have the experience of seeing the letter aleph and knowing the letter aleph? In other words, there's an I. It's not just a shape that's being transferred from one place to another. It's I know the aleph, and I take the aleph and my perception of the aleph, and I'm drawing another one. I'm drawing another one on the board. That's the mashal. Now, the question is, so the end of the mashal says like this, Derech Mitzvosecha, so it can be understood in a similar way. I'm on page 273. How from the knowledge of Atzilus is drawn down the mahus of the human intellect in a similar way. That there is no that the affected seichel, the human intellect, is not of the same mahus as God's wisdom in Atzilus, just as the physical letter is not in the ability of the hand to move, in the motor skills, in the motive power of the hand. Again, the human intellect is to God's wisdom in Atzilus. Human wisdom is to God's wisdom, or the human mind is to God's mind, as the physical letter on the board is to the keach hamaniya, the motive power of the hand, the power that is moving the hand. Right? If you try and find in the power that is moving the hand the form of an aleph as it's written on the board, you're sorely mistaken. Right? It's a translation. It's a metaphor. The spiritual form of the aleph goes from your mind and it goes into your hand, and your hand translates it into motions. And the motions translate it into an aleph on the board. And now someone looks at the aleph on the board and they say, I'm going to look in your hand, because the aleph obviously comes from your hand, and I'm going to find an aleph there. This is obviously a mistake. You're not going to find the aleph as it is in the board, in the person's hand, or in their ability to move.
It's like a computer that prints via the printer. So if you look at the printer has nothing. You just follow the instructions.
Correct.
Give it.
Exactly right. So too is is a human mind to God's mind in the world of Atzilus, so to speak, which is really what the Rambam is referring to, as we'll get into in a minute. So God's mind is to the human mind as the aleph in the spiritual sense, the aleph in the actual motions of the hand, is to the physical aleph on the board. One comes from the other. It comes from nowhere else except here. It must come through here. There is no other source for it. It comes from this, and yet nevertheless, and in some sense there's obviously a connection. The aleph in some sense does exist within the hand. It's just that it doesn't exist in the same way that it does on the board. It exists in a more abstract form. It exists in a more potential form, in a more spiritual form, in a more refined form. That's the mashal. The mashal is that to think that we know what it means for God to know something based on us knowing something is ridiculous. It's preposterous. How ridiculous is it exactly? According to the Sefer Yetzirah, it's as ridiculous as thinking that you will find an actual letter aleph if you look in the person's ability to draw an aleph, or the motion of the hand that's drawing the aleph, or the mind from which the aleph derives, right, at higher and higher levels. You're looking for the wrong sort of thing. Even though human intellect derives of the godly intellect, even though it is from the godly intellect that the human intellect is drawn, so to speak, and where its spiritual source is in God's intellect exists at a totally different level of abstraction. It's a totally different mahus. And that's why they're called the spheres bli ma. They're called the spheres without mahus, without whatness, without an essence. Meaning to say that from the human perspective, we cannot perceive, based on our minds, the essence of God's mind. Our minds do not connect to the essence of God's mind. God's mind is of a totally different sort. It's a totally different essence. It's like the physical aleph on the board compared to all of the spiritual motions and the motion of the hand that goes into creating the aleph. It's a totally different type of thing. So you would make a mistake to limit God's intellect by our understanding of the human intellect.
But what you're saying there is all the physical side of it. What about you visualizing the aleph in your mind?
That's even further away. That's totally spiritual. That's totally spiritual. You're saying because the form of the aleph comes from the mind. So theoretically, if you could access the mind, you would find the same form. That's true. But the mind is nothing like the actual physical aleph that's on the board. They have something in common, but at a totally different level of abstraction.
You obviously have to learn it, so you see it on the board.
Try to write.
You can't explain it.
Try to write when you have your eyes closed. I mean, if you write one letter, maybe.
That part, sure. But how do you learn what the aleph is first time round? Someone's got to do the aleph for you.
What point are you trying to make exactly? In other words, it's a metaphor. What point are you trying to make in the metaphor? Like you're saying that this is the metaphor doesn't make sense, or?
Well, we're dealing with one side of it.
Yeah, we're dealing with a specific. That's all it is. Every metaphor for God is in some way imperfect, and Chassidus acknowledges that. These metaphors are all in a very limited case. We're saying a specific aspect of it. That's all we're ever saying in these metaphors. These metaphors are not meant to be they only extend as far as they extend, right? They don't. In fact, that's the exact point we're saying. Actually, is that every metaphor can only extend so far. You can only the letter on the board is never going. You're never going to get to the higher level of abstractions if all you're looking for is the letters on the board. Right? The metaphors only go so far. That's in a sense what we're saying. V'lakach, I'm 4 lines up from the bottom of page 273. Lakach nekroim asfiros bli ma. Therefore, the spheres are called without ma, without substance. Koloimar bli mahus hanifo mehem. They are not of the same substance as that which is affected by them or created by them. Pirush, meaning shemahus hanifal, shemahus hanifal mahusayhu. Shukeach umakar haseichel. Aval sfiros chachma atzma inam mahus zeklal. Meaning that the what is created from the godly intellect is only the faculty of and the source of our intellect. But the sphira of Chachma itself, God's mind, is not of this type at all. In other words, the mind is, even the sources of our mind, the source of our minds is what is created by God's mind. In other words, we're at that remove, right? We have our minds, and then we have the source of our minds, and the source of our minds itself is only created by God's mind. Basically, is what we're saying. It's at a remove. So to think that we could go from our minds to God's mind and understand that they're of the same mohus is a mistake. They're not of the same mohus. They're not of the same essence, or of the same substance, as he's calling it here. And so too, his will is not of the same substance as our will. Therefore, there is literally no question for us, there is no question for us at all, the changes of his will, that the changes of his will should cause a change in God. Because changes in will, that we are affected by changes in our will, is only in our will. But since his will is not the same type of will as our will, and it is totally hidden and inconceivable to us, since he and his will are one, just as he himself is totally hidden from us. Page 275. So too his desire is totally removed from what we're able to understand. Therefore, we can understand that his will affects no change in him. And you cannot bring proof from our will on his will, because there is no comparison between our will and his will at all. Don't be fooled by the Sefer Yetzirah and the Kabbalah and the poetic metaphor. This is exactly the Rambam's position. This is a philosophical position. We haven't really made any Chassidic statement about this at all yet. This is purely the Rambam's position. Purely the Rambam's position is that God's will is totally united with him, and there is literally, it's just a category error to think that our will tells us anything about his will at all. Why would you assume so? Prove it. Prove to me that our will is the same as God's will. We say that he wills things. When we say he wills things, we mean in a metaphorical sense. The way we want him to build, we're talking to him as if he's a person and saying, we wish that you would change your mind to build the Beis HaMikdash. In other words, what we want is that there should be a Beis HaMikdash. And if a person were to build a Beis HaMikdash, after not having a Beis HaMikdash, it would indicate a change of desire. First, I did not desire to have one, and now I desire to build one. But with regards to God has his will is not limited in the way our will is. His will is absolutely infinite. He desires by desiring himself. And therefore, this problem that you think that asking him that he should change things, that one thing should change to another thing, you're limiting, your understanding is that God's will works the same way our will does. Where our will, we change because of our will, and the will changes for different things, God's will for different things within the world is simply one united and simple will, completely united with him, and there is no change whatsoever, and don't try and understand it. Because just as God cannot be understood, so too his will, which is him, which is totally united with him to the extent that he and his will are one, he is his will, which is the philosophical position.
That's Rambam.
That's Rambam, exactly. He and his will are one, so therefore don't try and understand his will. You'll have as much success understanding his will as you have understanding him. That's the position.
Why do we even think that God could or changes his mind?
What do you mean?
I mean, why do we have examples like that God wanted to do something and then he didn't do it?
Well, Yehi Ratzon in the Siddur.
But that's the thing. We do not know what is his meaning. I mean, the fact that he says one thing and he does one thing, maybe he didn't mean to do what he was saying. He was just testing us, to see what we say accordingly. How do you know?
No, when God tells us something in the Torah,
yeah,
he tells it to us in the Torah for a reason.
No, but I mean, God wanted to destroy, and then Moshe came to speak to him and say, okay, I'm not going to destroy. But maybe it was a test of Moshe to see how Moshe is going to perform, and God knew in advance what's going to happen. He didn't even have it in his mind to destroy.
Yes, exactly. We're not basing it on that. We're just basing this whole thing.
You're saying
that's not our example.
Right.
That example is more confusing. There's a lot of factors in that example. That's not our example. That example is too complicated. Our example is very simple. We say to God, may it be your will that you should rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. That's our example. And that's in the davening. That's a prayer that is put in the...
God didn't say that he's going to build or he's going to destroy. I mean, it's like, you say, you're going to sin, I'm going to destroy you. Okay. So, I mean,
but there is not a Beis Hamikdash now, and there will be tomorrow. Does that not indicate that something in God's will has changed?
No.
Why?
Destroyed, somebody's going to come and build it, so that's the new reality.
No, but obviously nothing happens against God. You're saying it happens against God's will?
No.
That He wants there to not be one, but if I go and build one now, I really showed Him because He didn't want there to be one. But now I build one. So He does want there to be one.
Of course, but I mean...
So before He didn't want there to be one?
No. There was one, it was destroyed.
Yeah.
He wanted it to destroy it.
He wanted it to be destroyed.
That's His will.
Yes.
Then somebody's going to come and build it. It was His will that somebody's going to come and build it.
Right, so
He
his
didn't
will,
change his mind.
So his will
he did change his mind. His will was that he didn't want it when it was destroyed.
Yeah.
Now his will was that he wants it when somebody comes to build it.
He wanted 3 temples to exist, 2 of them to be destroyed and 1 not.
But he's saying, why doesn't he want that all from the beginning? And we said that already. That's a Tosfos Yom Tov's position. The Tosfos Yom Tov is that everything was just one desire from the beginning. Mm-hmm. And we said that's possible, that's a legitimate position. We're looking at the Tosfos Yom Tov's position. Ultimately, that's not our position because you don't need to go that far. You don't even need to say that. In other words, we're saying you don't even need that explanation. You don't need to say it's all one will from the beginning.
I'm going to give you a very simple example.
Yeah.
Now you're drinking from that cup.
Yeah.
You're going to destroy it, right?
Yes.
Next week, Thursday, you're going to have a new one.
Yes.
Why did you destroy this one? You should have kept it and just have it on the next week.
But it's a different will. It's a different will.
It's the same thing. I mean, you do things.
But it's 2 different wills.
For things to happen.
Where do the things come from? The things are all under God's dominion. It's all His will. It's
That's
His
the
world.
way we do it. That's the
it's
way
His
our
world.
will
And
works.
he has his own way, which obviously we do not understand.
No, but I don't understand. It's 2
doesn't
different
change-
wills. If Ronnie wants water now and then later he doesn't want water, that's a change in his will. Unless you want to say that Ronnie wants water conditionally once at the beginning of his life. Ronnie decided when he was one day old, I'm saying this is a mashal for God, obviously, people don't work this way. But Ronnie wants water once in his whole life, and his one want for water is a want that is continuing over his whole life. It's just that when the details or when the situations change, it's built in that he only wants it under certain conditions. So he decides once, I want water every 3 hours, right? Then his will doesn't change, because every second hour when he doesn't want water, that's not a change, because initially there was only one will. The one will from the beginning was to only have a will for every 3 hours. That's what the Tosfos Yom Tov was saying. The one will from the beginning. It was only one will. Included in that one will was all of the change that will take place. The Tzemach Tzedek is saying that you don't even need to go that far. That's really far to go.
I'll tell you why, because if Ronnie would known in advance that he's going to regret and he wouldn't like to have the water later, he's not going to want it from the first place.
Maybe. Meaning to say what in the Nimshal?
So there's no change of mind.
Right. So the thing is, Tzemach Tzedek is saying you don't need to go that far, though. You don't need to go as far as to say that everything was built into the reality from the first place. We touched on last week why theologically this isn't a really good solution, because it's flirting with deism, it's flirting with the idea that God really abandons the universe, right? The Jews are on the shore of the sea, and they pray to God, please God, split the sea for us. And it's not really that God listens to them and He splits the sea, it's that once upon a time when God made the sea, He decided, okay, when the Jews show up, you'll split. In other words, the whole thing's, it's like the clockwork universe, right? Which is really the first step on the way to not needing a God whatsoever, because if the whole universe just operates by itself without God in the first place, God forbid to say so, which is heretical in Judaism. Mm-hmm. But if it were to do such a thing, so what do you even need God for, right? The sea was going to split on its own. God made the sea that it was split for the Jewish people in the beginning. It's not that anyone cares about you or is listening to you. He just happened to see this all from the beginning, so he made it happen that way. It's not. It doesn't fit with what Judaism says about God. Let's put it that way. It doesn't fit the Jewish perception of the universe. The Jewish perception of the universe is that you pray to God and God answers the prayer. Mm-hmm. The question is, but does that not mean He's changing His mind? And the answer is, you don't need to resort to this trick that we're reading into the Tosfos Yom Tov about it's one desire all from the beginning. Rather, all you need to understand is that the whole question in the first place, that based on the way human will works, where Ronnie wants water and then he doesn't want water and his will changes, God's will doesn't work like that. You're simply imposing limitations on God's will that you have no rational basis for imposing. There's no reason to assume that His will works the same as our will. Our will is a totally different mahus from His will. That's basically what we're saying. We're saying that philosophically speaking, there's no reason to think that God actually works this way.
What you're saying is that we just don't really have an understanding of the essence of God's knowledge.
Yes. That is exactly what I'm saying. That's the philosophical position.
Started from day one.
Absolutely. That's the philosophical position.
But
So we have the.
If I knew him, I would be like him. Of course, we do not understand.
Yeah. Okay. So it's like this.
Even the word itself to say knowledge. See, we have an idea.
Well, we try to.
Yes, the Rambam says as much. The Rambam says that no defined human word applies to God whatsoever. That's what
Remember,
the
we
Rambam says.
discussed. Is the knowledge within him, outside of him?
As we're actually going to mention that, Spencer. We're going to mention about the words in a second. So you have the human mind. Then you have,
don't picture wrong
let's say, the source of the mind. It's not a good example.
It doesn't even show in the mirror.
It's average. It's average. It's not the average human mind.
Average minus.
Okay. Then you have, I'll put it in quotes. Okay. Let's go a little further. How much time do we have? Very little. Okay, let's go a little further. I was hoping to go further. All right. 1 second. Okay. V'zesha Amar. I'm 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines down on page 275. V'zesha Amar Navi. This that the prophet says. Ki lo machshavosai machshavosechem. Very famous quote from Yeshayahu. My thoughts are not your thoughts. Elohem bir divrei Rambam zal. These are the explanation of the Rambam's words, the Rambam of blessed memory. Vanim shachim acharav, and all of those that hold that follow his opinion. B'hataras kushya inyan shnei haratzon, in answering the question of the change of God's will. In other words, what's the answer to the question? The answer to the question of how can God's will change is lo machshavosai machshavosechem. My thoughts are not your thoughts. God's nature is not human nature. You're just making a category error. You're imposing upon God the limitations of human nature. V'hu al derech mashakasav ve'il perek zayin, and this is the same as we said before in chapter 7. Divrei ha-philosophim b'inyan ha-Torah, the words of the philosophers with regards to the descriptions of God. Shehem shelalim, that the descriptions of God are all negative descriptions. As Spencer was just saying, the descriptions of God, when we say God has knowledge, according to the philosophers, according to the Rambam, we mean that God is not ignorant. We don't mean that he has knowledge. Because to say he has knowledge implies some sort of understanding of what he has. It implies some understanding of his mahus. There's a thing that we have, and he has the same thing. Even if he has it in a greater quantitatively or greater qualitatively, he has the same thing. The Rambam will tell you, no. God doesn't have the same thing. So when we say that God wills, we don't mean that he wills. We mean that he doesn't not will. We mean that he has more, he's not limited by any of our limitations, but that doesn't mean we understand how far he goes, right? It's like saying, I understand that I understand that the city of Atlanta is not limited to this room, right? How far does the city go? What's its exact borders? How far does the metro area extend? I have no idea. But I know that it's not limited to this room. So when we say, this is the Rambam's explanation, when the Torah says that God is wise, what is it saying? It's not saying that he has wisdom, because what that implies is that there's a thing we understand called wisdom, that we have, and we're saying God has that as well. The Rambam says, no. The philosophical position is that when the Torah says God has wisdom, it means he's totally lacking in unwisdom. He's totally lacking in ignorance. He's totally lacking in foolishness, right? These are things. God has none of these lacks. He has none of these limitations. He has none of these what are called in Hebrew chesronot. Yeah, he has no chisaron. There's nothing missing from him. He has no paucity, is an old English term for this idea.
Isn't it part of the Kal V'chomer?
What is?
I mean that God has different perspective. Not like ours.
Yeah. But what we're saying is that he's so far removed from us that we can't actually say b'derech chiyuv in a positive sense. We can't say what he is. We can only say b'derech shlila. We can only say in a negative sense what's called apophatic theology. We can only say what God doesn't have. The via negativa it was called in Latin. We can only say what God does not have. Negative theology. We know that we can't say that he has knowledge because he doesn't have knowledge, because the mahus of what he has that we call knowledge is not the same as the mahus that we have. He doesn't have knowledge. That's not accurate. It's not even accurate to say he has knowledge. He has all of the advantages that human knowledge has by being himself, but he doesn't have knowledge. He doesn't have any of our limitations, and he has all of our advantages, But the manner in which he has them is totally inscrutable to us. It's unknowable. He has them by dint of being God. It's like the famous joke, right? I think I may have mentioned it in this class before, that the Mittler Rebbe had the son of the Alter Rebbe, the son of the author of the Tanya. Many Chassidic courts at different times had a court jester. They would have one chassid who would play the fool, and he would say jokes, and he would make sure that everyone was cut down to size. Right? He would make fun of people, and that was his job, and make people laugh in the Chassidic gatherings and things like that, which is interesting. It's just like kings have jesters, so there were some Chassidic courts who had jesters, and the Mittler Rebbe had one. And this chassid once said that me and the Rebbe are exactly the same. Why? So they asked him, why are me and the Rebbe exactly the same? He says, me and the Rebbe are exactly the same because everything that I know, the Rebbe knows, and everything the Rebbe doesn't know, I also don't know. Right? So me and the Rebbe are exactly the same. Everything I know, he knows, and everything he doesn't know, I also don't know. So we're exactly the same. Right? It's the same idea here, right? Everything that we know, God has.
Yeah, but he was with one thing.
Yeah, there are some things that the Rebbe knows that he doesn't know, right?
That's the big,
So it's the same thing here, though, that God's wisdom is everything that our wisdom is, but it has none of the limitations that our wisdom has. But just because it has everything that our wisdom has doesn't mean it's limited to being the same as our wisdom. There could be much more to it. It could be much more perfect, much higher, a much greater thing. And indeed, this is the nature of God. In His unity and in His godliness, this is all the philosophical explanation, by the way, He has... by being himself, he has all the advantages of knowledge without any of the limitations of human knowledge. So do we really understand his knowledge? Not at all. But all we can say is that certainly he knows better than we do. Right? So when we say he has knowledge, really what we're saying is Derech Hashlila. It's the negative theology. We're saying God is lacking all the limitations of our intellect. And so too with regards to will, 3 lines up on page 275. That the only reason why we say that he acts willfully, that he has a will, is to understand and to negate that he is not necessarily act. The reason why we say God wills, the reason why we say may it be your will, what are we saying? We're not saying that God actually has a will like the human will. We're saying that he is not limited and bound to act by necessity, as sometimes we are. Right? We are forced to do something. We are compelled. The truth is that human beings are also rarely, it depends how you look at free will, but human beings are also rarely compelled. We're also beings of choice. But if you think more of something acting according to its nature, like an animal, right? An animal doesn't have free will, according to Torah. An animal acts out only according to its nature, according to its program. It's like a robot. So in some sense. So when we say that God wills, we don't mean to say that he actually has a will like a human will. God forbid, because that would limit him. This is all according to Rambam. Rather, what we're saying is that he is not limited to act necessarily. He doesn't have to do anything. Therefore, we call it a will. We call it a will because he's not bound by necessity. He doesn't have to do anything. Everything that he does because he wants it, whatever that means. But even saying he wants it is incorrect, because it's not the same way we want it. All we're trying to say is that he doesn't have to do anything. That's all we're saying. The negative theology, and that's what is meant by God's will in the Rambam's conception.
How can you say that an animal doesn't have free will? That's like an example. You have a cat and you put like.
Okay, let me 1 second. Let me finish the sentence in the recording because we're over time. I wanted to go further, so we don't really need the whiteboard today, unfortunately. But tomorrow, next week, God will. So bli kavana v'ratzon chas v'shalom. We don't want to say that he acts without intent or without will. God forbid. Ulefichach, and therefore, this is just the end of this section, second line on page 274, Therefore, this will obviously does not cause any change in him. The philosophical answer to the question, how can God's will change, is that the question is mistaken. The question imputes a human will upon God, where God's will is not a human will. God's will is totally inscrutable and infinite and not understandable, and he wills by willing himself. He wills within himself, just as his wisdom is. The only reason we say will is to negate the negative. We're saying he's not bound by necessity. But to say that God has a will like a human will is a mistake, and therefore he doesn't have the limitations of a human will. He doesn't have the limitations that his will has to change to want different things, or that the changes of his will affect him. None of these are issues with regards to God's will. It's all more or less, I'm simplifying things a little bit, but it's all an effect of his one will and one desire for himself, which human beings cannot understand. That is the philosophical answer to this question.
Okay, so